Hi, welcome to Virginia Time Travel, your portal to the Commonwealth's past, present, and future. Our guest today is preservationist, historian, and author Ed Wenzel, who has recently been honored by the Fairfax County History Commission for his book, Chronology of the Civil War in Fairfax County. The book covers, day by day, the Civil War history of Fairfax County during the first 2 years of the war. With more than 50 maps and more than 350 photos, this exhaustive study comes in at 618 pages. The 200-page index comes in its own volume. This is national history written through the local lens. Ed, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me on.
Great. So, wow, my hat is off to you, sir. So why did you write this book?
Well, it kind of was an accident. It started out with the Fairfax County Sesquicentennial Commission, and I was one of many on that committee, and we were meeting in 2009, and we were going to plan events and write text for historic markers and so forth for the commemoration for the 150th. And one of the first questions that was asked was, well, we know about Ox Hill, and we know about Lewinsville and Drainsville and Mosby's raid on Fairfax Courthouse and so forth. What else happened here? And so everybody looked at one another and said, we need to find out. So John McEnaugh and Don Hackinson and Paul Herbert and myself volunteered to form a subcommittee, and we would investigate all the events that occurred in Fairfax during the war and try to make some kind of a tabulation. And so we started meeting at the VFW post in Fairfax Station, and we would all come in there with an armload of books and sit down at the tables and spread everything out. And we just started keeping a, ballpoint pen and a sheet of lined paper, and we just start making a list. And the more we worked on it, the more we found out. And I would take all the notes home and what have you in the evening and type it up, and maybe I would work on it some at home in the evening and add to it, and then we come back for the next meeting and so forth. And after a couple of months, we decided to just drop the regular meetings at the VFW, and I just started working on it full time. And what started as a piece of information for the Sesquicentennial Committee, it then became obvious that what we were compiling would be of interest to anybody and everybody. Mm-hmm. It would be a good reference for the war in Fairfax County.
So who would you say this book is for? I mean, is it for real history buffs, Civil War buffs, or?
Well, it's not a regular history, and it's not a novel. Mm-hmm. It doesn't read like one. It's a reference book, and it would be for any researcher or historian or just any citizen of the county that's got an interest in what happened here. Because so much happened here. I mean, it was not only the battles that occurred within the county, but there were constant activity going on. There were troop movements to and from every major campaign in the East.
So now do you start when Virginia secedes or before, or what's your start date?
Well, the Union invaded of course, Northern Virginia on May 24th, 1861. But you couldn't just start at that date. You had to put some background in there. So we made a prelude to the war, which actually starts with John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry. Okay. And it goes through the election of 1860 and all the events that led up to the deterioration of the political climate that actually brought on the war. That's in a prelude, and that's, I don't know, that's 35 pages maybe of material on the prelude, and then you have the secession vote on May 23rd, and the Federals come across the bridges on the 24th.
Well, that's very interesting because the Federals come across the bridge on May 24th. So then do we do it day by day after that?
Absolutely.
Wow.
It's just constant activity.
Amazing.
And it's, you know, there's some parts of the calendar year where you might skip a day. I couldn't find anything for it, but a lot of the days are just pages and pages on the same day. I mean, just so many events going on with the movements and.
So now, does some of this come out of like letters and diaries and whatnot, or is it just kind of newspaper and official accounts?
Well, the bulk of the material came out of the official records of the War of the Rebellion. That's where all the detailed reports of the military actions, where you can find it, and a lot of the organizational tables and so forth. But a lot of the other things come out of regimental histories, a lot of the adjunct material, regimental histories, periodicals. All the historical societies and what have you in the county have their own newsletters and journals going back years and years. They were a great help to try to fill in the blanks, and they've published a lot of letters, and then, you know, whatever letters you can find, there's diaries and there's newspapers, you know, Harper's Weekly and so forth, and all that material is out there.
So in addition to, you know, the headline news, battle at Manassas, we got a lot of human interest stories here, I guess, too.
Oh, yeah.
Interesting.
Oh, yeah.
Now, how long did it take you to actually write the book?
Well, from beginning to end, it took 6 years and 10 months.
Wow.
And I wasn't the only one that worked on it. I realized early on that this book would require an index, and I hadn't a clue on how you would do that. And I'm a longtime member of the Bull Run Civil War Roundtable. I think you've interviewed Mark Turbovich and Jim Lewis and a few others here before. And I went to Mark and I said, look, I don't know how to do this. Do we have some people here in the roundtable that could help me with the publishing and the indexing? And Mark took a look at the manuscript and he said, sure, we'll do this as a sesquicentennial project. And so they picked up the challenge, and Charlie Balsh, one of our longtime members, and Steve Hull with the Hunter Mill Defense League, he was our tech guy. He knew all about the computers and how the ins and outs of indexing, by computer. And so, and David Mudrick, they did all the indexing, most of the indexing.
And if folks actually want to know where they can get the book, it's through the Bull Run Civil War Roundtable, right?
You just go to the Roundtable's website, bullruncivilwarroundtable.org, and you'll find it. They've got the flyer for the book posted up there, and there's links to the site, and that's where you can get it.
Great.
Or you can come to our meetings on the second Thursday of the month.
Great. Where are those held?
At the Centerville Regional Library, 7 p.m.
Okay, very good. Now, so what would you say your methodology was when you were, trying to make sense of all of this stuff? It's like,
well,
huge task.
Yes, but in a way, organizing the material was fairly simple because it was a chronology. So whatever I found, it was based on the date. And I might find I couldn't find the material in the order in which everything occurred, but I would find things that maybe occurred in November and I might be working in March. But if I found something, I just write it up. And what I did, I summarized the material so that I had to shrink it down to, maybe a few sentences, each event or incident, depending on what it was.
Well, now let's take something like when the Federals invade Alexandria. Do you have the Federal account and the Confederate account, or how do you treat the?
Would read both sides, all the reports in the OR from the Federals and the Confederates, and then sometimes you'd have disagreements, and you'd find out, well, you didn't do a little further investigation. Maybe some other officers wrote about it, or secondary sources covered it and figured it out already. Well, I would read what there was out there, and then I would combine the information and I'd try to synthesize it into one paragraph where I hit all the bases. You give the casualty numbers and, you know, the basic building blocks of what happened. And so that's the way I did it, was by summary. And each entry is a separate kind of event. And of course, the events flow, but you go from one thing to the next.
And where they don't agree, you just kind of point that out.
Right. I'll put notes in there if there's a conflict. If something is totally unbelievable, I might say that so-and-so author says this, but we are suspicious of it. And but I'll let people know that if they go to that source, they might have a problem with it.
Well, one thing that people who may not be familiar with the Civil War is the whole naming problem. I mean, the Union would call a battle one thing and the Confederates would call the battle something else. So how do you treat that in the book?
I'll call attention to it.
All right.
It's like the Battle of Blackburn's Ford. The Confederates called it the Battle of Bull Run. And I mentioned that because I found in a volume on Confederate monuments in Virginia, somebody commented about way down in Southwest Virginia, there's a monument in some courthouse square somewhere, and it says Battle of Bull Run. And really what they mean is Blackburn's Ford. But the author was questioning, now why would they put Bull Run on it, you know, when it's First Manassas, but they weren't talking about First Manassas.
Well, that's interesting. That's one of those details that it's fascinating. So what were some of the highlights of the first 2 years of the war?
Well, battles and other things going on. I suppose.
I mean, we got a lot of people who haven't lived in this area for a long time. You know, they arrive, they're here for a few years. You know, they're not steeped in it. You know what I mean? Yeah.
Well, in the first year of the war, of course, you have secession and you have the federal invasion of Alexandria and Fairfax. You have the raid right away by the federal cavalry on Fairfax Courthouse. You have the federal march out to Bull Run to seize Manassas Junction. Of course, they don't get to Manassas Junction. There's a couple of battles in between there, and after First Manassas, they retreat back to their defenses. And then the Confederates take over Fairfax County, and they establish outposts, and Jeb Stuart is in charge of the forward positions. And
now, a lot of people don't realize exactly how close to Washington the Confederates were. What was their high tide in Northern Virginia?
High tide, well, I guess I would say probably down in Alexandria, probably down around Cameron Run somewhere. I think there was I heard Don Hackinson had an article. He mentioned one of his books. There was a fight. I think Confederate troops marched from Fairfax all the way down there. Can't remember the name of the skirmish, but yeah, it was right down in Alexandria.
Well, I was surprised on a tour I took, one of Don's, that there was actually a skirmish inside the Beltway where Annandale is now, and I thought, wow, these guys are really close.
Oh yeah.
And I think they got even closer than that, as you say.
Yeah.
So.
Falls Church and Miners
So
Hill.
you know, this was really on the doorstep of the Capitol, literally. I mean, So we got the big battle. So you got First and Second Manassas. We've got John Mosby running around. What are some of the interesting, lesser-known facts that you came on?
Well, there's interesting things that pop up. You've got the women that were involved. For instance, you've got Antonia Ford, who ran out of Fairfax Courthouse to the Confederates to warn them about the approach of the Federals. You have Osceola Mason, stepdaughter of Wilbur McLean from Yorkshire. She's only 15 years old, and on July 21st, 1861, she discovers Federal pioneers cutting down trees and barricading the roads leading to McLean's Ford. And she calls him on it and says, "Why are you doing this?" And she's not happy about it. So she rides right back to the Confederate lines and tells General Ewell. And the first thing General Ewell tells Osceola Mason is, "Get away from here. You'll be killed. You'll be a dead damsel in less than a minute," you know. And she doesn't pay a slightest bit of attention to him. She keeps on going with her story. And General Ewell turns to Major Gordon and he says, "Women, I tell you, sir, women would make a fine brigade if it weren't for snakes and spiders."
That's a great story. That's wonderful.
But there's a lot of things that go on. There's the 4th Brigade Beehive at Centerville. The wife of one of the infantry commanders up there was in charge of that beehive, and she was protecting it. And the quartermaster came to get some honey, and she ran him off. I mean, there's just little tidbit
great.
stories that
it's those human interest things that really give you some insights. Now, I know there was a baby born on the battlefield at First Manassas. Did you cover that?
I never heard of that one.
Oh,
yeah, I never heard of that one.
Right in the middle of the First Battle of Manassas, baby born.
I know that there was a husband and wife involved in that fight. I came across that in one of the accounts. So.
Now you mentioned some of the personalities, but you've got a huge number of people coming into the area, all doing some pretty interesting things. So who are some of your favorite personalities out of the first 2 years of the war? You mentioned some of the women. Any colorful soldiers you want to mention?
Well, I would say, I mean, there were some officers running the Union side that were not that good. There were some colonels and what have you at that level, captains that were fine officers. You had Colonel Israel Richardson at Centerville, holding off the Confederates. He was a great fighter. You had Lieutenant Samuel Benjamin commanding the artillery there.
So what was
20-pounder Parrots.
What was so hot about these guys? I mean,
well, they were the men on the spot, and they were competent officers. Benjamin was a fine artillerist. He later, in 1862, commanded General Stevens' artillery at Ox Hill, and he. There's a lot of good ones. Torbert, Brigadier General Torbert, was commanding during the follow-up to 2nd Manassas. He was in charge of guarding all the roads through Fairfax to protect Pope's line of retreat and his communications.
Now, you mentioned the Battle of Ox Hill, and I think we ought to, doff our hats to you once again, because you were very much involved in the preservation of what is now called the Chantilly Battlefield. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, that goes back to 1986, and Brian Pohanka and Bud Hall and myself, when we became aware of the situation up there, we formed the Chantilly Battlefield Association, and we tried to, we wanted to save whatever we could that was left, but the key thing that got us involved was there was talk going around that they were going to move the monuments to Kearny and Stevens to another site because they were in the way. And
Kearny and Stevens were two Union generals.
Two federal generals who were killed in the Battle of Ox Hill or Chantilly, yes. So, yeah, we got
Chantilly was the southern name? And
the Union name.
Okay, right. It was a Union name.
Right. And you'll notice if you drive by the park, it says Ox Hill Battlefield Park. This is Virginia, not New York. But yeah, so we worked with the county. We met with the developers. We had agreements that the developers would give 2 acres, and the county would later chipped in with 2.5 acres, and we now have a 4.5 acre park up there.
But the whole initiative was, a private initiative taken on by private individuals.
Yeah, the main focus on that battlefield at the time was development. The protecting the heritage or the history that was there was a minor thing that, you know, I mean, let's face it, this is, you know, this area is full of people from somewhere else, and they have got jobs and they're busy, and they don't, you know, a lot of them don't know. And we have a lot of politicians that don't know either.
No.
And, you know, so it really wasn't planned that much be saved there.
Right.
They were going to save the memorial stones. They were going to save them by moving them somewhere else.
No, this is what they do with a lot of cemeteries. They, you know, they save them by moving them.
Right. So anyway, we now have a nice park up there that's original ground. This is the last 4.5 acres that was there, and it was restored and interpreted, and it's a fine little park. It has to tell the story of the entire battle, which covered hundreds and hundreds of acres.
Yeah.
But so we have 4.5 acres in the heart of it all that we can tell the story from.
Now, the Battle of Ox Hill / Chantilly was actually the only major battle fought in Fairfax County. Is that right?
That's correct. Right.
Exactly.
There were smaller ones. Lewinsville and Drainsville were two others in 1861. Ox Hill was in 1862. You had the battle at Bull Run Railroad Bridge in 1862. And you had the Battle of Grigsby's Hill, which was part of the Second Manassas fighting, but it was in Fairfax County around Compton Road, down along in that area.
Now, you know, there's still some undeveloped areas in Fairfax County, as hard as that is to believe, like Union Mills, for example. I mean, do we talk about Union Mills?
In the book?
Yeah, in the book.
Oh, there's a lot happened. Train wrecks in Union Mills, and they were, the Federals had outposts there, and Herman Hopt had his train crews coming through there. The Bull Run Railroad Bridge was destroyed many times. Sometimes it would be washed out in a flood. Sometimes it would be destroyed by cavalry, you know, coming in and burning it down. But Herman Hopt, in charge of the military railroads, he was an unsung hero of the war. That guy was on top of everything railroad. He was in charge of the logistics and getting the ammo trains out and moving troops through the county, moving wounded back in, you know.
Now, was he a railroad man to begin with?
He was,
Okay.
he was, yes.
And so he brought his expertise
Absolutely.
And railroads really were in their infancy. I mean, I think I read they weren't entirely sure they could get a locomotive across the Potomac because they were afraid the bridge would collapse. I don't know. I mean, you know, they're not. It was very new technology. One of the things that I found fascinating in your background is that you're a topographer, and how much does the book rely on maps, and were there any surprises in the maps that you found?
Well, I tell you, maps were very important to doing this study because, you know, if you go out there and look at the ground today, you see the sprawl, the subdivisions, the shopping centers, the 4 and 10 lane highways, and they're going everywhere. But so what I did, I had my own kind of I worked for the USGS, and I had my own personal collection of topographical maps, and the best of the ones that I had were published in 1951. In 1951, right in the post-war years, there weren't that many people in Fairfax yet, and it was still rural, and the topography that's on those maps was instrumental in going through when I'd go through the reports and I'd read what the officers were saying. I mean, the roads hadn't changed. Most of them were still in their Civil War alignments. And so I used those maps, you know, just for understanding what happened in the tactics and so forth and in the movements. And one of the things that I realized was those topographic maps that were done with 1949 aerial photography, they actually show the contours on some of the larger earthworks, and they were still there in 1951. You could see them. You can see them right on the map. You could see the alignment for the Manassas Gap Railroad grade going across the county, and you could follow it. I mean, no railroad there, but they had already built the earth, you know, the alignment for it.
Right. Interesting.
The cuts and the fills and so forth.
Now, did you match up the maps you were using with the military maps of the time?
I did. The McDowell maps were
they
the
good
best.
map makers back then, or
Oh,
or
they
not?
were excellent map
Were they?
makers, and they did it. Many times on horseback. I mean, and particularly coming into Virginia when you've got a war going on, those guys had to be, some of the roads in western Fairfax are not good. They're not. There's a lot of errors on the McDowell map when you get into western Fairfax, because I think they were hastily compiling maps, and they were not.
Yeah.
They didn't have field crews on the ground, like we would do. So, but the two together. The old maps have all the place names. The churches are all named. The depots and a lot of place names.
Well, we could go on and on because it's a big book, but I'm afraid we're out of time. I want to give you a little token appreciation. Our book, Civil War Graves of Northern Virginia. I want to thank you for being on the show, and we want to thank you for tuning in. This show has been brought to you by a generous gift from the Margarita W. and Donald J. Metzger Endowment. Please write to us at timetravel21@yahoo.com and visit our website at timetravel21.com. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.